Hey friend, tonight we step into the fading glow of an empire that once seemed untouchable. The year is 1809, and Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, the man who bent kingdoms and crowns to his will, stands at the height of his power. Yet even here, at the peak, the slow unraveling has already begun. The victories still come, but each carries more cost than triumph. Each decision made beneath the shadow of a destiny too vast for any man to hold. This is not the story of cannon thunder and endless charge, though those sounds echo faintly in the distance. Instead, it is the quiet story, the heavy march of weary boots across frozen fields, the candle flickering low in campaign tents, the tired eyes of soldiers staring into the embers of dwindling campfires. It is the hush of church bells tolling across villages shattered by war, the snow drifting silently onto the graves of those who never returned. Across 5 parts and 25 chapters, we will follow the emperor's journey from triumph to twilight, from the confident ruler of a continent to the exile of a small island staring out at the sea. It is a tale of ambition and exhaustion, of alliances made and broken, of faith strained and nations rising from beneath French rule. So lie back and let the story unfold slowly, like smoke curling into the night sky. The battles will come, the coalitions will gather, and the retreat into winter will bring silence more haunting than gunfire. Tonight, we begin where power seemed absolute, and yet, in truth, was already crumbling.
The empire at its height, the emperor of Europe. In the year 1809, to stand in the heart of Paris was to feel the pulse of the world. The city, once the chaotic crucible of revolution, now moved with a new imperial rhythm, a cadence set by the will of a single man. From the grand state-rooms of the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, surveyed a continent that he had not merely defeated, but remade in his own image. This was the apex, the high watermark of a tide of ambition that had risen from the battlefields of Italy and the sands of Egypt to wash over the ancient thrones of Europe. His power was a tangible thing, felt not just in the presence of his uniformed marshals and the intricate etiquette of his court, but in the very fabric of the continent. His brothers and sisters sat on the thrones of Spain, Holland, Westphalia, and Naples, a dynasty of Bonapartes supplanting the ancient lines of Bourbon and Habsburg. The old Holy Roman Empire, a relic of 1,000 years, had been swept away, replaced by the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of German states that looked to Paris, not Vienna, for its direction. From the shores of the Baltic to the heel of Italy, from the fields of Poland to the Pyrenees, Europe was either directly ruled by France, allied.
Life in the Tuileries was a carefully constructed theater of power. The emperor, no longer the lean, hungry general of his youth, had grown thicker, more settled, his movements deliberate and his gaze heavy with the weight of governance. He would work for 18 hours a day, his mind a whirlwind of activity, dictating letters to a relay of exhausted secretaries, poring over maps, reorganizing legal codes, and planning military campaigns with a level of detail that was both his genius and his obsession. The air around him was one of restless energy, a sense that the world could be ordered, rationalized, and improved if only enough will and intellect were applied. His greatest non-military achievement, the Code Napoleon, was spreading across his empire, a revolutionary document that enshrined legal equality, property rights, and religious toleration, sweeping away the feudal privileges and tangled laws of the old regime. For many, he was not a conqueror, but a modernizer, a bringer of order and progress, a new Charlemagne forging a... Yet, even at this moment of supreme triumph, a quiet fragility lay beneath the surface. The empire was a creation of will, not of nature. It was held together by the force of his personality and the intimidating might of his grande armée. Its borders were not ancient, settled frontiers, but the high watermarks of recent campaigns, lines drawn on a map by the tip of a sword. The loyalty of his allies was often a matter of pragmatism, not affection. The monarchs he had defeated and humbled watched him from their diminished courts with a resentment that was patient and deep. The common people of Spain, of Germany, of Austria felt the stirrings of a new kind of identity, a national consciousness forged in opposition to French domination. And across the Channel, implacable and beyond his reach, was Great Britain. Its factories churned out the sinews of war, its banks funded the coalitions that rose against him, and its Royal Navy, a silent gray wall upon the sea, enforced a blockade that slowly, methodically, sought to strangle his empire's commerce. In the quiet candlelight of his study, as Napoleon traced the lines of his vast dominion on a map, he must have known that his creation, for all its magnificence, was an edifice built on a battlefield. It had been won by war, and it would have to be maintained by war. The stillness of 1809 was not the stillness of peace, but the quiet, deep breath taken before the next inevitable storm. The Fifth Coalition forms. While Paris celebrated its emperor, a different mood was gathering in the capitals of the old Europe. In Vienna, the silence that had followed the humiliating defeat at Austerlitz 4 years earlier was finally breaking. The Habsburg monarchy, the most ancient and proud dynasty on the continent, had been shamed, its lands partitioned, its influence shattered. But the spirit of resistance had not been extinguished. It had merely been waiting for a sign of hope. That hope was now kindled by events far away in the sun-baked hills of Spain, where Spanish peasants and partisans were waging a brutal guerrilla war against Napoleon's brother, King Joseph. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon would later call it, was a constant drain on French resources and manpower, and it demonstrated a crucial fact: the imperial eagle was not invincible. For the statesmen and generals in Vienna, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The Austrian Empire began to stir. Under the patient and determined guidance of Archduke Charles, the emperor's brother and a formidable military commander in his own right, the Austrian army was undergoing a quiet and radical transformation. Charles had studied the lessons of past defeats. He was reorganizing the army along French lines, creating corps systems for greater flexibility, fostering a new spirit of patriotism and professionalism in the ranks, and forming a Landwehr, a national militia, to bolster his regular forces. This was more than just a military reform. It was a national awakening, a wave of patriotic fervor, fueled by writers, poets, and a government-sponsored propaganda campaign swept through the German-speaking lands of the empire. Napoleon was cast as a godless tyrant, an oppressor of nations, and the war was framed not as a dynastic struggle, but as a holy crusade for the liberation of Germany. In the coffee houses of Vienna, young men spoke eagerly of driving the French back across the Rhine. The air was thick with the scent of war. Napoleon, occupied with Spain and the complexities of his vast empire, initially underestimated the scale and intensity of the Austrian resolve. He believed the Habsburgs were too cowed, too broken to challenge him again so soon. But his spies and diplomats sent increasingly urgent warnings. Austria was rearming at a furious pace. British subsidies, the financial lifeblood of every coalition against France, were once again flowing into Vienna's coffers. Archduke Charles was massing over 300,000 men on the frontiers of Bavaria and Italy. The choice facing Napoleon was stark. He could try to de-escalate through diplomacy, or he could meet the challenge head-on. For a man whose entire identity was built on forward momentum and the projection of strength, there was only one real option. He left the war in Spain to his marshals and raced back toward Paris, sending out orders with furious speed, mobilizing his veteran troops from their garrisons across Germany and calling up fresh levies of conscripts from France. The Fifth Coalition, for now consisting of Austria and Great Britain, had been born. In the spring of 1809, as the snows melted in the Alps, the Austrian columns crossed the border into Napoleon's allied kingdom of Bavaria. The peace was broken. The Danube, the great river of Central Europe, would once again become the stage for a monumental struggle between the old order and the new. The Battle of Aspern-Essling. Napoleon's response to the Austrian invasion of Bavaria was swift and brilliant. In a lightning campaign of less than a week, known as the Ratisbon campaign, he seemed to be the general of old. He caught the dispersed Austrian forces by surprise, defeated them in a series of sharp engagements, and forced Archduke Charles to retreat. The road to Vienna was open. In early May, for the second time in 4 years, the tricolor flag of France flew over the Austrian capital. To many, it seemed the war was already over, another textbook Napoleonic victory. But Archduke Charles was no broken commander. He had managed to withdraw his main army in good order, retreating across to the north bank of the Danube, destroying the bridges behind him. He now waited, his army of over 100,000 men drawn up on the vast flat plain of the Markfeld, daring Napoleon to come across the river and fight. The Danube, swollen with spring meltwater, was a formidable obstacle, wide and fast-flowing. Napoleon, eager for a decisive war-ending battle, chose a spot just east of Vienna to make his crossing, using the large island of Lobau as a staging point. His engineers began the Herculean task of building a pontoon bridge from the south bank to the island, and then a second, shorter bridge from the island to the north bank. It was a perilous undertaking. On the 20th of May, under the watchful eyes of the Austrians, the 1st French Corps began to cross to the north bank. They occupied the 2 small, sturdy villages that would give the battle its name, Aspern on their left and Essling on their right. These 2 villages, with their stone houses and garden walls, became the anchors of the French position. Napoleon intended to bring his entire army across and then advance to engage Charles on the plain. But the Archduke had other plans. He was not going to wait for the French to assemble their full strength. As soon as a significant French force was on the north bank, he launched a massive, coordinated assault. 5 Austrian columns, a great wave of white uniformed infantry, surged forward to attack the 2 villages. The battle that erupted was one of savage, unrelenting ferocity. Aspern and Essling became slaughterhouses, their streets and churchyards choked with the dead and dying. Control of the villages swayed back and forth, houses were taken and retaken room by room in a desperate close-quarters struggle. As the fighting raged, disaster struck the French.
the Austrians began floating heavy barges, trees, and even a whole watermill down the fast-flowing Danube. This debris smashed into Napoleon's fragile pontoon bridge, shattering it and cutting the flow of reinforcements and ammunition to the troops on the north bank. The French forces, now isolated, were fighting for their lives. The battle continued for 2 brutal days. Napoleon himself was in the thick of it, exposing himself to enemy fire, rallying his men. But the Austrian pressure was immense, their artillery pounding the French lines, their infantry launching wave after wave of attacks. It was during this battle that one of Napoleon's closest friends and most brilliant marshals, Jean Lannes, was mortally wounded, his legs shattered by a cannonball. The sight of the dying marshal, a man who had fought alongside him since the first Italian campaigns, deeply shook the emperor. By the evening of the second day, Napoleon knew the battle was lost. The bridge was broken beyond immediate repair. His ammunition was low, and his men were exhausted. He had no choice but to order a retreat, pulling his battered forces back to the relative safety of the island of Lobau. It was his first major personal defeat on the battlefield. The myth of his invincibility had been shattered on the banks of the Danube. As his weary soldiers huddled on the island, with the Austrians celebrating their victory just across the water, the Emperor of Europe had been given a powerful and bloody reminder that his grip on the continent was far from secure.
Wagram, victory at a cost. The defeat at Aspern-Essling was a shock that resonated across Europe. For the first time, Napoleon had been met, matched, and forced to retreat by an enemy in a major engagement. The news emboldened his enemies and gave hope to the subjugated nations of the continent. But for Napoleon himself, it was a moment not of despair, but of cold, calculating fury. He turned the island of Lobo, his refuge after the retreat, into a massive fortress and military depot. For 6 weeks, he gathered his strength, summoning reinforcements from every corner of his empire. The Grande Armée swelled to over 180,000 men, a colossal force of French, Italian, Bavarian, and Saxon troops. He meticulously planned his second crossing, determined not to repeat the mistakes of the first. He ordered the construction of multiple sturdy pontoon bridges, protected by stockades and guarded by gunboats. He was preparing not just for a battle, but for a masterpiece of logistical and military engineering. On the night of July 4th, 1809, under the cover of a ferocious thunderstorm that masked the noise of his preparations, he unleashed his plan. Instead of crossing again at the site of his earlier defeat, he threw his new bridges across a different, undefended section of the riverbank, surprising the Austrians completely. By morning, a huge French army was deployed on the Marchfeld Plain, having outmaneuvered Archduke Charles and rendered his defensive preparations useless.
The battle that followed, the Battle of Wagram, was a confrontation on a scale Europe had rarely seen. Nearly 300,000 men and over 1,000 cannons were arrayed on a vast flat plain under the sweltering July sun. This was not a battle of subtle maneuver like Austerlitz. It was a brutal, head-on collision of 2 massive armies, a contest of attrition and raw firepower. The fighting raged for 2 days. On the first day, a premature and confused French evening attack was repulsed, and the night was spent in nervous anticipation. On the second day, the battle reached its terrifying climax. Archduke Charles launched a powerful attack on the French left flank, threatening to roll up Napoleon's entire line and cut him off from his bridges over the Danube. The situation became critical. To counter this, Napoleon ordered a desperate measure. He gathered a grand battery of over 100 cannons in his center and unleashed a thunderous, continuous bombardment on the Austrian lines, a storm of iron that shook the earth and tore great holes in the white-coated ranks. Under the cover of this immense cannonade, he launched his final decisive assault. He formed a massive attack column led by General MacDonald and aimed it like a battering ram at the weakened Austrian center. The column, a dense square of thousands of men, advanced slowly and grimly into a storm of Austrian fire. The casualties were horrific. MacDonald's column was shredded, but it did not break. It pushed forward, a moving bastion of flesh and bayonets, creating a breach in the Austrian line. At the same time, Marshal Davout's corps, on the French right, finally succeeded in turning the Austrian left flank. Assailed from the front and the flank, his center broken, Archduke Charles knew he could no longer hold the field. He ordered a general orderly retreat. Napoleon had won. But it was a victory unlike any other he had achieved. It was a bloody, grinding triumph bought at a terrible price. The French had suffered over 34,000 casualties, the Austrians even more. The field of Wagram was a silent, horrifying landscape of death and suffering. The victory secured the war. Austria sued for peace shortly after, but it lacked the decisive brilliance of his earlier triumphs. It had been a victory of brute force, not of genius. It suggested that the quality of his troops was declining, that his enemies were learning, and that the cost of maintaining his empire was being measured in ever-increasing rivers of blood.
The strain of endless war. The Treaty of Schönbrunn, signed in the autumn of 1809, was a harsh peace imposed on a defeated Austria. The Habsburg Empire was stripped of its Adriatic ports, forced to cede territory to Bavaria and the Duchy of Warsaw, and compelled to pay a massive indemnity. On the surface, it was another great Napoleonic triumph. The Fifth Coalition was broken, and the Emperor's authority over Central Europe seemed more absolute than ever. He returned to Paris to parades and celebrations, the master of the continent. But beneath the veneer of victory, the foundations of the empire were groaning under a relentless and growing strain. The war against Austria, though successful, was just one front in a conflict that had become perpetual. The very nature of Napoleon's power demanded constant motion, constant victory. Peace was not a state of being, but merely an interval between wars. This reality was beginning to take a heavy toll, not just on France's enemies, but on France itself and its allied states.
The most immediate strain was economic. The continental system, Napoleon's grand strategy to defeat Britain by closing all European ports to its trade, was proving to be a double-edged sword. While it did cause hardship in Britain, it caused even greater disruption on the continent. The great port cities of the empire, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Bordeaux, saw their maritime trade wither and die. Smuggling became a massive enterprise, and the enforcement of the system required a vast and unpopular network of customs officials and soldiers, stretching the empire's administrative capacity to its limits. Industries that relied on colonial goods like sugar and cotton collapsed, while the price of everyday necessities soared. The system bred resentment everywhere, turning erstwhile allies into sullen and unwilling partners in an economic war that seemed to be hurting them more than the enemy. The constant need for soldiers was another source of deep and growing weariness. Conscription, the annual levy of young men, had become a fact of life in France and its satellite kingdoms. Each year, the emperor's demands grew. The blood tax, as it was bitterly called, reached into every village and every family. While victory had once made the sacrifice palatable, the endless nature of the wars was turning patriotism into a grim resignation. The veterans of the early glorious campaigns, the men of Austerlitz and Jena, were dwindling, replaced by younger, less experienced, and less enthusiastic recruits. The Grande Armée was becoming less French and more of a multinational patchwork, its loyalties more complex and its cohesion more fragile.
This exhaustion was not just a French phenomenon. In Germany, the victory at Wagram had been a blow to nascent nationalism, but it had not extinguished it. Secret societies like the Tugendbund, League of Virtue, continued to meet, dreaming of a day of liberation. In Italy, the weight of French taxes and conscription soured the initial welcome for Napoleon as a liberator. And in Spain, the brutal guerrilla war continued to rage, a daily bloody demonstration that military occupation did not equate to control. It was a war with no front lines and no decisive battles, a war of ambushes and reprisals that consumed tens of thousands of French troops and bled the empire of men, money, and morale. Europe, from the peasant in his field to the merchant in his counting house, was tired. It longed for a true and lasting peace, a return to normalcy. But peace was the one thing the Napoleonic system could not provide. The empire was a creation of war, and its emperor, for all his genius as a lawgiver and an administrator, was fundamentally a man of the sword. The quiet strains of 1810 were the hairline fractures appearing in a vast and magnificent structure, hinting at the catastrophic failure to come.
Cracks in the empire. The marriage to Marie-Louise. In the aftermath of the Wagram campaign, Napoleon turned his attention from the battlefield to the bedchamber. His greatest vulnerability was not a foreign army, but a matter of biology. He had no legitimate heir. His marriage to Josephine de Beauharnais, a passionate and devoted partnership, had been barren. For an emperor who sought to establish a dynasty that would rival the ancient houses of Europe, this was an existential crisis. His empire, forged in his own lifetime, would die with him unless he could produce a son. With a cold and painful pragmatism, he made the decision to divorce the woman he loved for the good of the empire he had created. In a quiet, tearful ceremony, the imperial couple separated. Josephine retired to her chateau at Malmaison, and Napoleon began the search for a new empress.
His initial choice was the younger sister of Tsar Alexander I of Russia. An alliance with Russia was the cornerstone of his continental system, and a marriage would seal it in blood. But the Russians prevaricated. The Tsar's mother was vehemently opposed to the match, and the Russian court dragged its feet, offering polite but clear resistance to the Corsican upstart. Napoleon, impatient and ever the pragmatist, did not wait. He withdrew his proposal and immediately turned to his most recent, most ancient enemy, Austria. The idea was audacious. A marriage to a Habsburg archduchess would be the ultimate symbol of his triumph and acceptance. It would link his new revolutionary dynasty with the oldest and proudest royal family in Europe. For Austria, defeated and humiliated, the offer was a bitter pill to swallow, but also a lifeline. A marital alliance with their conqueror offered security, a chance to rebuild, and a way to regain influence at the very center of European power. The Austrian foreign minister, Metternich, saw the strategic advantage immediately. The deal was struck with remarkable speed. In 1810, Marie-Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of the Austrian Emperor Francis I, traveled to Paris to marry the 40-year-old man who had repeatedly defeated her father and seized her country's lands. She was a young, sheltered woman, raised to despise Napoleon, now being delivered to him as a political offering. The wedding was a spectacle of imperial grandeur, designed to awe Europe and legitimize the Napoleonic regime. The old French nobility who had shunned Napoleon's court were now forced to mingle with the new military aristocracy. The ceremony deliberately mirrored the royal weddings of the old Bourbon kings. Napoleon was not just marrying a woman, he was attempting to marry his new revolutionary France to the ancient traditions of monarchical Europe. And for a time, it seemed to work. Marie-Louise, though initially fearful, grew to be fond of her powerful husband. and in March of 1811 she fulfilled her primary duty. After a long and difficult labor, she gave birth to a son, Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph Bonaparte, who was immediately given the title King of Rome. The bells of Notre Dame pealed, cannons fired a 101-gun salute, and the city of Paris erupted in celebration. Napoleon was ecstatic. He now had an heir. His dynasty, he believed, was secure. But this union, sealed in silk and celebrated with cannon fire, could not mend the deep cracks in his empire. The marriage to an Austrian princess alienated Russia, adding another layer of distrust to an already fraying alliance. And it did nothing to change the fundamental reality. The empire was built on conquest, not consent, and no royal marriage could truly transform the grudging submission of defeated nations into genuine, lasting loyalty. The Spanish Ulcer. While Napoleon was celebrating the birth of his heir in Paris, his soldiers in Spain were dying in a war without glory. The Iberian Peninsula had become a festering wound for the French Empire, a conflict that stubbornly refused to conform to any of the rules of warfare that Napoleon had mastered. It had begun in 1808 as a swift military occupation to enforce the continental system on Portugal and to replace the corrupt Spanish monarchy with his brother, Joseph. Napoleon had expected a quick and easy victory. Instead, he had ignited a nation. The Spanish people rose up in a brutal, spontaneous, and fanatical wave of resistance. This was not a war of armies and pitched battles, though there were those too. This was a small war, a guerrilla, waged by peasants, priests, and bandits. A war fought in rugged mountain passes and in the back alleys of cities. The French, masters of the decisive battle, found themselves completely unprepared for this kind of conflict. They could control the major cities and the main roads, but the countryside remained fiercely hostile. A French patrol that left a garrisoned town might never be seen again. Supply convoys were ambushed, messengers were intercepted, and stragglers were mercilessly killed. The war took on a horrifyingly savage character. The Spanish guerrilleros fought with a religious fanaticism, seeing the French as godless invaders. The French, in turn, responded to the ambushes and assassinations with brutal reprisals, burning villages and executing civilians. It was a vicious cycle of violence that turned Spain into a charnel house and consumed the morale of the French soldiers stationed there. The soldiers called it the Cursed War. They were fighting an invisible enemy in a landscape that hated them, far from home, with little chance for the fame and plunder that had motivated them in other campaigns.
Compounding the problem was the presence of a British army, first under Sir John Moore, and later under the command of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Wellington was a cautious, brilliant defensive general. He understood that he could not defeat the main French armies in a head-on confrontation. Instead, he played a long game, using Portugal as a secure base, protected by a massive line of fortifications called the Lines of Torres Vedras. From this sanctuary, he would launch raids into Spain, fighting when the odds were in his favor and retreating when they were not. He worked in concert with the Spanish guerrillas, forcing the French to disperse their forces to guard against both a conventional army and a popular uprising. The Spanish Ulcer drained the French Empire relentlessly. It tied down hundreds of thousands of Napoleon's best troops, men who were desperately needed on other fronts. It was a constant drain on the French treasury, and it provided a permanent foothold for Britain on the continent, a staging ground for future operations. Most importantly, it was a powerful symbol of resistance. The news from Spain of French armies bogged down and defeated gave hope to patriots and nationalists all across Europe, proving that the will of a people, however poorly armed, could stand against the might of the Grande Armée.
Britain at sea, ever defiant.
Beyond the shores of Europe, in the gray waters of the Atlantic and the English Channel, lay the ultimate source of Napoleon's frustration, Great Britain. The island nation was the one enemy he had never been able to bring to battle on his own terms. His dream of an invasion of England had died in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar, where the Royal Navy had annihilated the combined French and Spanish fleets. That victory had given Britain an unassailable command of the seas, a dominance that shaped the entire course of the Napoleonic Wars. While Napoleon's armies marched across the land, the wooden walls of the Royal Navy moved silently and ceaselessly upon the waters, a global power that he could not touch. This maritime supremacy allowed Britain to play a unique role in the wars. It could not defeat France on its own, but it could ensure that France was never truly at peace. It became the financier and the enabler of every coalition that rose against Napoleon. Its vast wealth, generated by a burgeoning industrial revolution and a global trading network, was used to pay subsidies to Austria, Prussia, and Russia, keeping their armies in the field when their own treasuries were empty. The Royal Navy protected these shipments of gold and guns, ensuring the sinews of war reached Napoleon's enemies.
The primary weapon Britain wielded was the blockade. From their stations off the major ports of Europe, British warships enforced a suffocating quarantine on the French Empire. They intercepted merchant ships, seized their cargo, and slowly strangled the life out of French maritime commerce. This blockade was the reason behind Napoleon's continental system. If he could not defeat Britain at sea, he would defeat it by closing every market in Europe to its goods. The result was a vast, continent-wide economic war, a struggle for commercial survival. But the Royal Navy's reach was global. While the ports of Europe languished, British traders found new markets in South America, the Caribbean, and the Far East. The British economy, though strained, proved resilient. The Royal Navy also enabled direct military intervention. It was the fleet that allowed Wellington's army to operate in Portugal and Spain, keeping it supplied and giving it a safe line of retreat if necessary. It projected British power across the globe, snapping up French colonial possessions from the West Indies to the Indian Ocean. Every French island, every overseas outpost was vulnerable to a British amphibious assault.
This constant, implacable pressure from the sea had a profound psychological effect on Napoleon. It was the one element he could not control, the one piece on the grand chessboard that would not conform to his will. He could march to Vienna, to Berlin, to Madrid, but he could not cross the 21 miles of water that separated Calais from Dover. This frustration fueled his obsession with the continental system, driving him to ever more extreme measures to enforce it, measures that would ultimately lead him to make the two fatal strategic errors that would destroy his empire, the invasion of Spain and the invasion of Russia. Britain's defiance was a constant, nagging reminder of the limits of his power. It was the anchor that held the resistance of Europe in place, the quiet, patient, and unyielding force that would, in the end, outlast his dazzling empire of the land.
The seeds of Russian distrust. The alliance between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia had been the diplomatic centerpiece of Europe since 1807. Forged on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River after the crushing Russian defeat at Friedland, the Treaty of Tilsit had divided Europe into French and Russian spheres of influence. The two emperors had professed a deep personal admiration for one another, and for a few years this partnership held the continent in a tense balance of power. Napoleon saw Russia as the key to his continental system, the great Eastern partner that would help him suffocate Britain economically. Alexander, for his part, saw the alliance as a way to buy time, to recover from defeat and to pursue his own ambitions in Finland and against the Ottoman Empire. But from the very beginning, the alliance was built on a foundation of shifting sand. It was a partnership of convenience, not of conviction. And by 1810, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore.
A primary source of friction was the continental system itself. Russia was a vast agrarian nation whose economy depended heavily on trade with Britain. The cutting of these trade ties caused immense hardship for the Russian landowning aristocracy, the powerful class upon which the Tsar's own power depended. The value of the ruble plummeted, and discontent grew in the salons of St. Petersburg. Alexander found himself under increasing pressure to abandon a policy that was crippling his country for the benefit of his French ally. Another major point of contention was Poland. Napoleon had created the Duchy of Warsaw out of former Prussian and Austrian territory, a revived Polish state that was a loyal French satellite on Russia's very doorstep. For Russia, which had participated in the original partitions of Poland, the existence of the duchy was a constant source of anxiety. They feared, with good reason, that Napoleon might one day use it as a springboard to restore a fully independent Polish kingdom, which would mean stripping Russia of its own Polish territories. Napoleon's talk of Polish independence was a powerful tool to ensure the loyalty of the Poles, but it was a direct threat to Russian interests.
The personal relationship between the two emperors also began to sour. Napoleon's marriage to the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, after being politely rebuffed by the Russian court, was a clear diplomatic slap in the face. It signaled a shift in Napoleon's strategic focus toward an alliance with his old enemy, Austria, which only deepened Russian suspicion. Furthermore, Napoleon's annexation of the Duchy of Oldenburg, a small German state whose ruler was the Tsar's uncle, was a personal insult and a flagrant violation of the Tilsit Treaty. It was a clear demonstration that Napoleon would redraw the map of Europe as he saw fit, without regard for the pride or interests of his supposed ally. Alexander began to see Napoleon not as a partner, but as an insatiable aggressor whose ambition had no limits. The friendship born on the raft at Tilsit had dissolved into a cold and wary rivalry. By the end of 1810, Russia had quietly reopened trade with Britain through neutral ships. In the palaces of Paris and St. Petersburg, the diplomats still spoke the language of alliance, but the generals were beginning to study their maps. The two largest armies on the continent were slowly, silently, turning to face each other across the plains of Eastern Europe.
The quiet grumbling at home. In the streets of Paris and the villages of rural France, the mood was changing. The days of revolutionary fervor and the heady excitement of the early imperial victories were fading into a weary memory. In their place grew a quiet, deep-seated exhaustion, a sense of resignation to a state of perpetual war. The most immediate cause of this discontent was the ever-present reality of conscription. Every year, the lists would be posted in the town squares, and another class of young men, barely out of their teens, would be called up to serve the emperor. What had once been a patriotic duty was now widely seen as a blood tax, a terrible price paid by French families to fuel Napoleon's foreign ambitions. The stories that filtered back from the fronts were no longer just of glory and promotion, but of the endless, grinding misery of the war in Spain, of disease, and of battles where the casualties were counted in the tens of thousands. The sight of wounded veterans and the increasing number of families in mourning were a constant, grim reminder of the cost of the empire.
The economic hardships caused by the long wars and the continental system also began to hit home. While the system was designed to cripple Britain, it created shortages and high prices in France itself.
Colonial goods like sugar, coffee, and cotton became expensive luxuries. The collapse of maritime trade devastated the coastal cities, while even in the interior, economic uncertainty and the disruption of old commercial patterns led to business failures and unemployment. A severe financial crisis in 1810-1811 exacerbated the situation, shaking public confidence. People began to grumble that the emperor cared more for his soldiers than for his merchants and farmers. This discontent was mostly quiet, rarely breaking out into open opposition. Napoleon's police state, under the watchful eye of the ruthlessly efficient Joseph Fouché, was adept at suppressing any organized dissent. The press was heavily censored, and criticism of the regime was dangerous. Yet the grumbling was there, in the cafes, in the marketplaces, and in private letters. People began to long for the peace and stability that the emperor had once promised, but seemed unable to deliver.
There was also a growing sense of disillusionment among the old elite, both the restored royalist nobility and the new Napoleonic aristocracy. They had reaped the benefits of the empire, titles, lands, and wealth, but they now wished to enjoy them in peace. They saw the emperor's restless ambition as a threat to their own security and prosperity. They wanted the wars to end, for the empire to consolidate its gains and settle into a predictable, stable order. But Napoleon seemed incapable of stopping. His nature was one of constant motion. He believed that to stand still was to fall. This disconnect between the emperor's personal ambition and the growing desire of his people for rest was a dangerous political rift. The foundations of his support, once rock solid, were being eroded by a quiet but pervasive weariness. France had given Napoleon its sons and its treasure, and in return he had given it glory. But as the years of war dragged on, a growing number of Frenchmen began to wonder if the price of that glory was becoming too high.
The road to Moscow. The Grand Army assembled. By the spring of 1812, the quiet diplomatic friction between France and Russia had escalated into an unavoidable collision course. Napoleon, convinced that Tsar Alexander's defiance and his reopening of trade with Britain were a direct challenge to his entire continental system, decided that he had to force Russia back into line. He would not do this with threats or negotiations, but with a display of military power so overwhelming that it would awe the Tsar into submission without a fight. He began to assemble the largest European army ever seen, a force designed not just to defeat Russia, but to stun it into paralysis. This was the Grande Armée of 1812, and it was a military machine on an unprecedented scale. It was an army of nations, a testament to the vast reach of Napoleon's empire. At its core were the veteran French Corps, the heart and soul of his fighting force. But marching alongside them were soldiers from every corner of the continent. There were disciplined Prussians and Austrians, their states compelled by treaty to provide troops to fight alongside the man who had so recently defeated them. There were Poles, who saw Napoleon as their best hope for national restoration and fought with a desperate bravery. There were Italians from the Kingdom of Italy, Bavarians, Saxons, Westphalians, Dutch, Swiss, and even a contingent of Spanish and Portuguese. All spring, these disparate forces marched eastward across Germany, converging on the plains of Poland. The logistical effort required to supply such a host was monumental. The roads were clogged with an endless column of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Behind them came thousands of supply wagons, herds of cattle on the hoof, and a vast apparatus of blacksmiths, surgeons, engineers, and administrators. The total number of soldiers who would eventually cross into Russia approached 600,000, a moving city of men and horses. Napoleon himself arrived to oversee the final preparations, a whirlwind of energy,
micromanaging every detail. He reviewed his troops, his presence electrifying the ranks. To his soldiers, he was still the near mythical figure, the bringer of victory. But this army was different from the lean, battle-hardened force that had conquered at Austerlitz. A large portion of it consisted of young, inexperienced conscripts and reluctant foreign allies whose loyalty was questionable. The very size of the army was itself a weakness, making it unwieldy and incredibly difficult to supply, especially in the poor and sparsely populated lands of Eastern Europe.
Napoleon's plan was classic. He intended to strike fast and hard, to cross the Russian frontier and force the Russian army into a decisive battle near the border. He believed that in a single massive confrontation, his superior numbers and tactical genius would grant him a swift victory. He would crush the Tsar's army, march on to a major Russian city like Vilnius or Smolensk, and from there dictate a new peace that would bring Russia to heel for good. He envisioned a short, sharp campaign, over in a matter of weeks. As he stood on the banks of the Niemen River, the border of the Russian Empire, looking out at the endless ranks of his magnificent army, he was at the zenith of his military power. He was the master of Europe, at the head of a force that seemed invincible. He believed he was on the threshold of his greatest triumph, one that would cement his control over the continent forever. He had no way of knowing that he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to lead his great army not to victory, but into the vast, silent emptiness of the Russian winter.
Crossing the Niemen. On the night of June 23, 1812, a profound silence settled over the Polish side of the Niemen River. The vast Grande Armée waited in the darkness. Napoleon, dressed in the simple uniform of a Polish colonel to avoid being recognized, rode to the riverbank to personally scout crossing points. The air was heavy with anticipation. At dawn on June 24th, the order was given. The first French pontoon bridges were thrown across the water, and the crossing began. It was not a clash of arms, but a silent, inexorable flow of men. For 3 days, the river of soldiers poured into Russian territory. There was no enemy to be seen. The Russian pickets had withdrawn, melting away into the vast forests. The only sound was the tramp of hundreds of thousands of boots, the rumble of wagon wheels, and the jingle of cavalry harnesses. The invasion of Russia began not with a bang, but with a strange, ominous quiet.
Napoleon established his first headquarters in the city of Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. He had expected to fight a major battle for the city, but the Russians had abandoned it without a fight. He was greeted by the local Polish and Lithuanian nobility as a liberator, and he spent several weeks there setting up a provisional government and dealing with the immense administrative challenges of his campaign. But this halt, though politically necessary, proved to be a critical delay. The Russian armies, under the command of Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration, were continuing to retreat deeper and deeper into the Russian interior, refusing to give Napoleon the decisive battle he so desperately craved. It was a strategy born of necessity. The Russians knew they could not defeat the full might of the Grande Armée in a single engagement. Their only hope was to draw the French in, to stretch their supply lines to the breaking point, and to let the vastness of Russia itself become their greatest weapon.
As the French pushed eastward from Vilnius, they began to encounter the true nature of their enemy. It was not the Russian army which remained elusively out of reach, but the land itself. The roads were little more than dirt tracks, which the summer rains turned into impassable rivers of mud. The supply wagons, the lifeline of the army, became bogged down, falling further and further behind the main columns. The soldiers, carrying only a few days' rations, began to go hungry. The heat was oppressive, and disease, particularly dysentery from contaminated water, began to scythe through the ranks. Horses, poorly fed and exhausted, began to die by the thousands, crippling the cavalry and the supply train. The landscape was sparse, with small villages and poor farms that were quickly stripped bare of any food. The
The silent emptiness of the land was more unnerving than an armed enemy. The army, so magnificent on the banks of the Niemen, was already beginning to disintegrate from within, not from battle, but from exhaustion, sickness, and hunger. The further they marched, the more the great army seemed to be dissolving into the immense, indifferent landscape. Napoleon grew increasingly frustrated, poring over his maps, trying to force a confrontation that the Russians skillfully denied him. The short, sharp war he had planned was becoming a long, slow pursuit into an endless void.
The scorched earth strategy. As the Grande Armée pressed deeper into Russia, the nature of the Russian resistance became terrifyingly clear. It was a strategy of denial, a war waged not just by soldiers, but by the entire population and the land itself. Following the orders of the retreating Russian commanders, and often acting on their own initiative, the local people began to systematically destroy anything of value that the French might use. This was the scorched earth strategy, a tactic as old as warfare itself, but employed on a scale that stunned the invaders. As the French advanced, they found a landscape of desolation. Villages were abandoned, their wells poisoned, their houses burned to the ground. Fields of ripe grain were set alight, sending vast columns of smoke into the summer sky. The great stores of food and fodder that Napoleon's planners had counted on finding in Russian towns simply did not exist. They had been evacuated or destroyed. The French soldiers, marching through this man-made desert, felt a growing sense of dread. They were not liberating a grateful populace, nor were they conquering a rich and pliable country. They were marching into an abyss, a void that seemed to swallow them up.
The psychological effect of this strategy was profound. The soldiers of the Grande Armée were accustomed to living off the land, a system that had worked well in the rich, densely populated regions of Italy and Germany. Here, in the vast emptiness of Russia, it was a recipe for disaster. Foraging parties had to travel for miles to find even the meagerest supplies, making them vulnerable to attack by roving bands of Cossacks and peasant partisans. The lack of food, especially for the horses, was catastrophic. Without fodder, the cavalry horses weakened and died, robbing the army of its eyes and ears and its ability to pursue the enemy effectively. The draft horses that pulled the cannons and supply wagons also perished, forcing the soldiers to abandon vital equipment by the side of the road. The army began to shed its strength, not in a great gush of blood on the battlefield, but in a slow, steady hemorrhage of men and horses lost to hunger, disease, and exhaustion.
Napoleon himself was deeply troubled by this turn of events. He had never faced such a strategy before. He was a master of a chessboard where the pieces moved in predictable ways. Here, the board itself seemed to be dissolving under his feet. He pushed his army harder, faster, desperate to catch the main Russian force and bring an end to this nightmarish advance. He captured the city of Smolensk, a holy city for the Russians, after a bloody battle, but he found it, like all the others, burned out and empty of supplies. He had captured a shell. It was at Smolensk that he made the fateful decision. Some of his marshals urged him to stop, to consolidate his position, and to winter there, resuming the campaign the following year. But for Napoleon, to stop was to admit failure. His entire system was built on the aura of unstoppable forward momentum. He believed that one more push, one more battle, would bring him to Moscow, the ancient capital, and that its capture would surely force the Tsar to sue for peace. He ignored the warnings of his marshals and the grim reality of his dwindling army. He ordered the march to continue, eastward, toward Moscow, deeper into the vast and desolate heart of Russia.
Borodino, the day of slaughter.
The relentless Russian retreat had caused deep frustration not just for Napoleon, but within the Russian army and court as well. The commander-in-chief, Barclay de Tolly, a cautious and professional soldier of German descent, was widely criticized for surrendering so much sacred Russian soil without a major fight. The pressure on Tsar Alexander to replace him became immense. Finally, bowing to the demands of his nobles, the Tsar appointed a new commander, the aging, one-eyed, and deeply Russian Prince Mikhail Kutuzov. Kutuzov was a wily and experienced veteran, a student of the great Suvorov, and he understood that Barclay's strategy of retreat was tactically sound. But he also understood that he could not surrender Moscow, the spiritual heart of Russia, without giving battle. The morale of the army and the nation demanded it. He chose a defensive position about 75 miles west of Moscow, near a small village called Borodino. Here, on a rolling landscape of low hills and ravines, he would make his stand. The Russian army dug in, building a series of large earthen fortifications, or redoubts, to strengthen their line.
On September 7, 1812, the two armies finally met in the confrontation Napoleon had been seeking for months. It was to be one of the bloodiest single days of fighting in the entire history of the Napoleonic Wars. The Grande Armée, though greatly diminished since crossing the Niemen, still numbered around 135,000 men. Kutuzov's force was slightly smaller, perhaps 120,000, but they were fighting on their home soil for their faith and their country in prepared defensive positions. Napoleon, who was suffering from a bad cold and seemed uncharacteristically lethargic, rejected his marshal's suggestions for a wide flanking maneuver. Instead, he opted for a brutal, unimaginative frontal assault on the Russian lines. The battle began at dawn with a massive artillery bombardment from hundreds of French cannons. Then the French infantry columns advanced, plunging into a maelstrom of cannon and musket fire. The fighting centered on the Russian fortifications, particularly the Great Redoubt in the center and the three arrow-shaped Bagration Fleches on the left.
What followed was not a battle of elegant tactics, but a pure, horrific slugging match, a contest of raw courage and endurance. The French would advance, capture a section of the redoubts in a desperate hand-to-hand struggle, only to be driven out by a ferocious Russian counterattack. The fields of Borodino became a hellish landscape, obscured by thick black powder smoke, the ground littered with the dead and dying. The French cavalry launched charge after heroic charge, and the Russian infantry stood firm, absorbing the blows with a stolid, almost fanatical bravery. By the end of the day, the French had managed to capture the main Russian fortifications, but the Russian army, though horribly battered, was not broken. It retreated in good order, leaving the field to Napoleon. He could claim a victory, but it was a victory of the most hollow kind. The French had suffered some 30,000 casualties, including 49 generals. The Russians had lost even more, perhaps 45,000 men. The battlefield was a silent testament to the slaughter. Napoleon had won his great battle, but he had failed to destroy the Russian army. Kutuzov was allowed to withdraw his surviving forces, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon had paid a ghastly price for a victory that had decided nothing.
Moscow in flames. A week after the slaughter at Borodino, the vanguard of the Grande Armée crested a ravise and saw before them the goal of their long and terrible march, the city of Moscow. With its hundreds of gilded church domes and the exotic, imposing fortress of the Kremlin, it seemed like a city from a fairy tale, an oriental jewel at the heart of Russia. For the weary French soldiers, it was a promised land, a place of rest, food, and shelter, the prize that would surely mark the end of the war. Napoleon himself rode to the Sparrow Hills, overlooking the city, expecting to receive a delegation of city fathers, the boyars of Moscow, coming to surrender the keys to their ancient capital and beg for his mercy. He waited and waited, but no one came. A profound, unnerving silence hung over the city. Cautiously, the French troops entered Moscow, their boots echoing in the empty streets. The city was a ghost town. Almost the entire population, following the retreating Russian army, had evacuated, taking with them anything of value. The city had been abandoned to the conquerors.
The French soldiers, disappointed but relieved, dispersed throughout the city, seeking out houses for quarters and searching for food and wine. They found vast cellars stocked with luxuries, and for a brief moment the misery of the campaign was forgotten in a wave of plunder and celebration. But that night the first fires broke out. At first they were dismissed as accidents, the result of careless soldiers with cooking fires. But soon, fires were erupting simultaneously in different districts of the city. It quickly became clear that this was a deliberate, planned act. The city's governor, Count Rostopchin, had arranged for the city's fire pumps to be removed or destroyed, and had released prisoners from the jails with orders to set the city ablaze. The fire, fanned by a strong wind, grew into a monstrous, uncontrollable inferno. For 4 days, Moscow burned. The wooden city became a sea of flames, the sky glowing an apocalyptic red, the air thick with smoke and ash. The French soldiers were forced to flee their looted quarters, their hopes of a comfortable winter turning to ash before their eyes.
Napoleon, who had taken up residence in the Kremlin, was forced to evacuate as the flames licked at the walls of the ancient fortress. He watched the destruction of the city from a distance, a look of grim fury on his face. He had captured the prize, but the prize was destroying itself before his very eyes. The fire of Moscow was a symbolic act of defiance of unimaginable scale. It was a declaration that the Russian people would rather destroy their own holy city than let it provide comfort to the invader. It was the scorched earth policy taken to its most extreme and devastating conclusion. When the fire finally burned itself out, 2/3 of Moscow was a blackened, smoking ruin. The Grande Armée now occupied a pile of rubble, with winter fast approaching and no sign of a peace offer from the Tsar. Napoleon had marched thousands of miles, lost tens of thousands of men, and captured the enemy's capital, only to find himself in a strategic dead end, the master of a wasteland, with the Russian winter gathering on the horizon.
The long retreat. Winter descends on the Grand Army. For 5 weeks, Napoleon lingered in the ruins of Moscow, trapped by a fatal indecision. He clung to the hope that the capture of the ancient capital would force Tsar Alexander to the negotiating table. He sent peace feelers, but they were met with a resolute silence from St. Petersburg. The Tsar, encouraged by the fanaticism of his people and the advice of his generals, had sworn he would not negotiate as long as a single French soldier remained on Russian soil. As Napoleon waited, the season turned. The first snowflakes began to fall, a gentle, almost beautiful dusting that carried a terrifying warning. The Russian winter, the army's most feared enemy, was arriving. The forage for the remaining horses ran out, and the starving animals were slaughtered for food. Without cavalry, the army was blind. The discipline that had held the troops together began to fray, dissolving into a desperate search for food and warmth. Finally, in mid-October, Napoleon was forced to accept the grim reality. There would be no peace. To stay in Moscow was to be entombed. He gave the order to abandon the city and begin the long march back to the west.
The retreat began with a semblance of order.
The army was accompanied by a vast, chaotic column of wagons loaded not with military supplies, but with the loot of Moscow: gold, silver, fine furniture, and silks. Every soldier was burdened with plunder, a testament to a victory that had turned to ashes. Napoleon's initial plan was to retreat via a more southerly route, through unspoiled country where they might find supplies. But a sharp engagement with Kutuzov's revitalized Russian army at Maloyoroslavets blocked this path. Though the French won the battle, it convinced Napoleon that the southern route was too risky. He made another fateful decision. The army would retreat along the same route it had advanced on, the Smolensk Road, a path that had already been stripped bare and turned into a desert. It was a corridor of desolation, and the army was now marching back through it, into the teeth of the approaching winter.
Soon, the weather turned with a vengeance. The temperature plummeted. The gentle snowfalls became driving blizzards. The soldiers, still dressed in their summer uniforms, were completely unprepared for the brutal cold. Their boots wore out, and they were forced to wrap their feet in rags. Frostbite became rampant, turning hands and feet black. The daily march became a shuffling, stumbling ordeal through deep snow and biting wind. The soldiers huddled together for warmth, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with despair. Food ran out almost completely. They slaughtered the last of their horses, roasting the flesh over pitiful fires, their blood staining the snow. When the horses were gone, they ate whatever they could find: candle tallow, leather from their harnesses. Starvation and hypothermia began to claim men by the thousands. The road became littered with the frozen bodies of those who had fallen and could not get up again. The retreat devolved from a military operation into a desperate flight for individual survival. The only thing that drove them forward was the instinct to live, the faint hope of reaching the relative safety of Smolensk, where they believed great stores of food and winter clothing awaited.
The Berezina Crossing. The retreat to Smolensk was a nightmare of starvation and cold, but when the ragged survivors of the Grande Armée finally staggered into the city, they found not salvation, but another circle of hell. The promised stockpiles of food and supplies were far smaller than rumored, and what was there was quickly consumed by the first units to arrive. The supply depots were looted in a chaotic frenzy, and the administrative order of the army collapsed completely. Smolensk offered no real respite, only a few days of shelter before the march had to continue. The Russian armies, though they avoided a major confrontation, were now beginning to harry the flanks and rear of the disintegrating French column. Kutuzov's main army followed from behind, while other forces under Wittgenstein and Chichagov moved to cut off the line of retreat further west. The trap was slowly closing.
The most critical point came in late November at the Berezina River. The river, normally frozen solid at this time of year, had thawed due to a brief spell of warmer weather, and its waters were now a churning mass of icy slush. The main bridge had been destroyed, and the opposite bank was held by a fresh Russian army under Admiral Chichagov. Napoleon's army was now cornered, with the river before them and two other Russian armies closing in from the north and east. This was the moment that should have seen the final, total annihilation of the Grande Armée. It was a situation of absolute desperation. It was also the moment that Napoleon's genius, which had seemed dormant for so long, flickered back to life. He devised a brilliant deception. He sent a small force south, making a great show of preparing to cross there. Chichagov, fooled by the feint, moved the bulk of his army south to meet the expected crossing, leaving the real crossing point at the village of Studyanaka, lightly defended.
While the Russians were being lured away, Napoleon's elite Dutch pontoon engineers, the Pontooniers, performed a miracle of courage and duty.
wading chest deep in the freezing, treacherous water, they worked tirelessly for hours, building 2 makeshift trestle bridges over the river. Many of them would die from hypothermia, but they did not stop until the bridges were complete. The crossing began. The corps of Marshal Oudinot and Marshal Ney, which still retained a semblance of military order, fought a desperate rearguard action, holding off the converging Russian armies while the rest of the survivors shuffled across the fragile bridges. The scene at the crossing was one of apocalyptic chaos. The 2 narrow bridges were swamped by a terrified mob of soldiers and civilian stragglers, all pushing and shoving to get across. The Russian artillery began to pound the crowded riverbanks, causing horrific casualties. One of the bridges broke, plunging hundreds of screaming people into the icy water. The crossing of the Berezina was a tactical victory for Napoleon. He had saved the remnant of his army from certain destruction. But it was a human catastrophe. Thousands died on the bridges or on the riverbanks. It was the final, agonizing trauma of the long retreat. The name Berezina would enter the French language as a synonym for disaster.
The shattered remnants return. Once across the Berezina, the final pretense of the Grande Armée as a fighting force evaporated. The relentless cold returned, more severe than ever. The retreat became a rout, a stream of frozen, starving specters stumbling westward through the snow. All discipline was gone. Men abandoned their muskets, their comrades, their very humanity in the desperate, animalistic struggle to survive. The road was a frozen tableau of horror, marked by the dark shapes of the dead, half buried in the snowdrifts. Of the nearly 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen River 5 months before with such pride and confidence, only a scattered few thousand would make it back. The official report would later state that around 93,000 men straggled back across the river, but this number was deceptive. It included garrisons and other units that had not marched to Moscow. Of the Central Army group that Napoleon had personally led to the Russian capital, perhaps fewer than 20,000 survived the retreat. An army had been not just defeated, but annihilated.
In early December, with the army reduced to a leaderless mob, Napoleon made a controversial decision. He left the final command to his brother-in-law, Marshal Murat, and departed for Paris. Traveling incognito in a sleigh, he raced across Poland and Germany, driven by the need to get back to his capital, raise a new army, and reassert his political authority before the full scale of the disaster became known and his enemies could take advantage of it. His departure was seen by many of his soldiers as an act of abandonment, but for Napoleon, it was a political necessity. The empire was not the army. The empire was him. His presence in Paris was more important than his presence with the shattered remnants of his force. Back in France, the first heavily censored reports began to appear. The 29th Bulletin of the Grande Armée was a masterpiece of propaganda, admitting to severe difficulties caused by the weather, but framing the campaign as a strategic success, marred only by an act of God. But the truth could not be contained. As the few thousand gaunt, frost-bitten survivors limped back across the Rhine, their stories spread, and the sheer, unimaginable scale of the catastrophe slowly dawned on France and on Europe. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility, which had been cracked at Aspern-Essling, was now utterly shattered in the snows of Russia. The Grande Armée, the instrument of his power and the terror of Europe, was gone.
Europe awakens. The news of the destruction of the Grande Armée in Russia spread across Europe like a seismic shock. For years, the continent had lain under the heavy shadow of Napoleonic dominance, its rulers cowed into submission, its people resigned to French hegemony. The Russian disaster changed everything. It was as if a spell had been broken. The sight of the once invincible emperor being humbled not by another army, but by the snow and sky of a vast, unconquerable land, sent a jolt of hope through the subjugated nations.
The quiet grumbling of nationalists and the secret plotting of patriots now erupted into the open. The time for silent resentment was over. The time for open rebellion had arrived. The first to move was Prussia. The Kingdom of Prussia had been deeply humiliated after its defeat at Jena in 1806, reduced to a second-rate power, its army limited, its territory truncated, and forced to be a reluctant ally in Napoleon's Russian campaign. But in the years of occupation, a powerful reform movement had been at work, modernizing the state and, more importantly, rebuilding the army and fostering a powerful sense of German national identity.
The catalyst for Prussia's defection was a single bold act. General York von Wartenberg, the commander of the Prussian corps that had been forced to serve with Napoleon, found himself isolated in the east as the French retreated. On his own initiative, without orders from his king, he signed the Convention of Tauroggen with the Russians, declaring his corps neutral. It was an act of calculated treason against his French allies, but an act of supreme patriotism in the eyes of his countrymen. King Frederick William III of Prussia, a naturally cautious man, hesitated at first, but the tide of public opinion was too strong to resist. Spurred on by his generals and ministers, he signed a formal alliance with Russia and, in March of 1813, declared war on France. He issued a proclamation, "On mein Volk," to my people, calling on all Germans to rise up and fight for their freedom in a great war of liberation. The response was electric. All across Prussia and the other German states, volunteers flocked to join the army. Students, artisans, and poets enlisted alongside regular soldiers. A wave of patriotic fervor, fueled by the songs of writers like Ernst Moritz Arndt and the speeches of philosophers like Fichte, swept through Germany. The war was no longer a matter for kings and cabinets. It had become a people's war. Sweden, under the rule of Napoleon's former marshal, Bernadotte, also joined the new coalition, lured by the promise of acquiring Norway. And Britain, ever the steadfast enemy, poured money and supplies into the continent to fuel the growing insurrection. The slow unraveling of the empire had become a rapid, headlong collapse. Napoleon, working furiously in Paris to raise a new army of young conscripts, was no longer fighting to expand his empire, but to save it.
The Sixth Coalition forms. By the spring of 1813, the political map of Europe had been redrawn by the winds of change blowing from the east. The Sixth Coalition was taking shape, an alliance that was broader and more determined than any Napoleon had faced before. It was initially forged by the alliance of Russia, Prussia, Great Britain, and Sweden, but its ultimate success depended on the stance of one great, wavering power, Austria. The Austrian Empire, under the cunning and patient guidance of its foreign minister, Prince Clement von Metternich, played a delicate and calculated game. Austria was Napoleon's father-in-law, bound to him by the marriage to Marie-Louise. But it was also a nation that had been repeatedly defeated and humiliated by France, and it yearned to regain its lost territories and prestige. Metternich did not rush to join the coalition. Instead, he positioned Austria as an armed mediator, a neutral party that sought to broker a peace. It was a shrewd move that gave him immense diplomatic leverage. He offered Napoleon a way out, a negotiated peace settlement that would roll back France's borders to a more natural frontier, but would leave Napoleon on his throne.
Napoleon, however, was not a man inclined to compromise, especially from a position of perceived weakness. He had performed a near miracle in France, raising a new army of over 200,000 men in a matter of months. They were mostly teenage conscripts, Marie-Louises as they were nicknamed, lacking the experience and stamina of the veterans lost in Russia, but they were soldiers nonetheless. He marched this new army into Germany, determined to remind Europe of his military genius
and to crush the upstart coalition before it could gain full strength. In May of 1813, he did just that. At the battles of Lützen and Bautzen, he met the combined Russo-Prussian armies and, through sheer tactical brilliance, defeated them. But these were victories that, like Wagram, came at a high cost and decided little. His lack of experienced cavalry, lost in Russia, meant he could not properly pursue and destroy the defeated allies. They were able to retreat in good order, their armies battered but intact.
The victories, hollow as they were, reinforced Napoleon's belief that he could still win the war on his own terms. After Bautzen, a temporary armistice was called, and the powers met at a peace conference. This was Metternich's moment. He met with Napoleon in a famous, stormy interview in Dresden. He laid out Austria's peace terms, which would have required Napoleon to give up his German and Polish territories. Napoleon, enraged, threw his hat on the ground and railed at Metternich, accusing him of treachery. "My ligaments are of a different kind from those of your drawing-room dandies," he famously sneered. "I can stand the loss of 1,000,000 men." He rejected the Austrian proposals out of hand, convinced that his father-in-law would never dare to declare war on him. It was a colossal miscalculation. His arrogance and refusal to compromise pushed Austria into the arms of his enemies. In August 1813, the armistice expired, and Austria formally declared war on France. The Sixth Coalition was now complete. It was a grand alliance of nearly every major power on the continent, united by a single purpose: the final, definitive overthrow of the French emperor. The stage was set for the largest and most decisive battle of the Napoleonic Wars.
The Fall of the Emperor. Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. With the end of the armistice, the war in Germany resumed on a scale that dwarfed all previous campaigns. 3 massive Allied armies, an overwhelming force of Austrians, Russians, Prussians, and Swedes, began to converge on Napoleon's position in Saxony. Their strategy, known as the Trochenberg Plan, was simple but effective. They would avoid engaging Napoleon himself directly, but would attack his marshals wherever they found them. This strategy slowly wore down the French forces and pushed Napoleon back toward a central point. That point would be the city of Leipzig. In mid-October 1813, the armies began to gather there for a final apocalyptic confrontation. Napoleon, with around 190,000 men, found himself facing a combined Allied force that would eventually swell to over 360,000. It would be the largest battle fought on European soil before the First World War. A true Völkerschlacht, a battle of nations. The battle raged for 4 days, a sprawling, chaotic struggle that engulfed the city and the surrounding villages, fields, and rivers. The first day saw ferocious fighting as the Allies launched assaults from the south and north. Napoleon's troops, though outnumbered, fought with desperate courage, and he managed to hold his ground, even launching a massive cavalry charge that nearly broke the Allied center. But he could not land a decisive blow. The Allies had learned their lessons. They had immense reserves of manpower, and they simply fed more and more troops into the grinder, replacing their heavy losses. As the battle continued, the iron ring around Leipzig tightened. The sheer weight of numbers began to tell. The French, fighting on all fronts, were running dangerously low on ammunition. The turning point came on the 3rd day. During a lull in the fighting, the Saxon and Württemberg troops, German contingents fighting for Napoleon, suddenly defected to the Allies in the middle of the battlefield. They turned their guns around and began firing on their former comrades. This act of betrayal ripped a huge hole in the French lines and shattered the morale of the remaining German troops in Napoleon's army.
By the evening of the third day, Napoleon knew the battle was lost. His only option was to retreat. But his retreat was poorly planned. There was only one main bridge over the Elster River, available for his entire army and its baggage train to escape. The retreat began in the darkness, a chaotic and desperate affair. The Allied armies stormed the city of Leipzig, and the fighting devolved into a brutal street-by-street struggle. The final disaster occurred when the single bridge was blown up prematurely by a panicked French sapper, trapping a third of Napoleon's army, over 30,000 men, on the wrong side of the river. They were forced to surrender. The French rearguard, including the heroic Polish Prince Poniatowski, was annihilated. Leipzig was a catastrophic, undeniable defeat. The French lost over 70,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The Grande Armée of 1813 had been shattered, just as its predecessor had been in Russia. The battle destroyed what was left of French power in Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved, and the German states abandoned Napoleon. His empire east of the Rhine had ceased to exist. All that was left was a desperate flight back to France, with the victorious armies of a united Europe in hot pursuit.
France under siege. The retreat from Leipzig was a sad echo of the retreat from Moscow. The battered remnants of Napoleon's army streamed back toward the Rhine, harried by Allied cavalry and ravaged by a typhus epidemic that claimed thousands more lives. By the end of 1813, the French had been pushed back across the river. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the sacred soil of France itself was about to be invaded by foreign armies. The empire was collapsing on all fronts. In the south, Wellington's British and Spanish forces had driven the French out of Spain and were now crossing the Pyrenees into southwestern France. In Italy, the Austrians were advancing, and Napoleon's viceroy, Eugene de Beauharnais, was fighting a desperate holding action. The nation that had once terrified Europe was now itself surrounded, besieged, and exhausted.
Back in Paris, the mood was grim. The magic of the emperor's name was wearing thin. The legislative body, long a rubber-stamp institution, dared to voice its opposition, demanding peace and civil liberties. Napoleon, enraged, dissolved the assembly, declaring, "France has more need of me than I have need of France." He called for a new levy of 900,000 men, a staggering number, but the country was bled dry. The blood tax had finally exceeded the nation's ability to pay. The response was weak. Draft evasion and desertion were rampant. The France that Napoleon was now calling upon to defend itself was a tired, broken nation that yearned only for peace. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming disaster, the early months of 1814 saw one last brilliant flash of Napoleon's military genius. In what is known as the 6 Days Campaign, he took command of a small, outmatched army of young conscripts and veterans and, through a dazzling series of rapid marches and surprise attacks, inflicted a string of defeats on the scattered Allied columns advancing toward Paris. It was a performance worthy of his first Italian campaign, a masterclass in tactics where speed and audacity substituted for numbers.
But these victories, while brilliant, could not change the strategic reality. For every Allied soldier his small army defeated, 3 more were on the march. The Allies were no longer willing to negotiate. Their aim, now openly declared, was the overthrow of Napoleon and the capture of Paris. While Napoleon was busy fighting in the east, the main Allied armies under the Austrian Prince Schwarzenberg and the Prussian Marshal Blücher bypassed him and marched directly on the French capital. The defense of Paris, entrusted to Napoleon's brother Joseph and Marshal Marmont, was brief and half-hearted. The city's marshals and politicians, seeing the situation was hopeless and eager to save the capital from destruction, entered into negotiations. On March 31, 1814, the Allied armies, with Tsar Alexander of Russia and King Frederick William of Prussia at their head, made their triumphal entry into a subdued and war-weary Paris. The long wars that had begun with the French Revolution had come full circle. The foreign monarchs that France had once defied were now masters of its capital. The abdication at Fontainebleau. While the Allies entered Paris, Napoleon was at the Palace of Fontainebleau, a few dozen miles to the south, still rallying his troops for a final, desperate attempt to retake the capital. But the war was no longer being decided by soldiers. It was being decided by his own marshals and ministers. The men he had raised from obscurity and showered with titles and wealth had had enough. They saw that continued resistance was futile and would only lead to a destructive civil war and the ruin of France. They wanted to save what they could of their own positions and to secure a future for themselves in the new regime that was certain to come. A delegation of his most senior marshals, led by the brave and outspoken Marshal Ney, confronted Napoleon at Fontainebleau. They told him the stark truth: the army would not march on Paris. The cause was lost. They urged him, for the good of France, to abdicate.
Napoleon was initially furious, raging at their disloyalty. But as he looked at the grim, determined faces of the men who had fought for him across a continent, he realized his authority was gone. The personal loyalty that had been the bedrock of his power had finally crumbled under the weight of endless war and catastrophic defeat. His will, which had bent Europe, could no longer bend his own generals. Broken and isolated, he agreed to abdicate, but on one condition: that his son, the King of Rome, would succeed him as emperor, with Marie-Louise as regent. He sent his envoys to Paris to present this offer to the Allies. But as they were negotiating, a final fatal blow was struck. Marshal Marmont, Duke of Ragusa, one of Napoleon's oldest comrades, who was commanding the corps defending Fontainebleau, secretly marched his entire force over to the Allied lines and surrendered. This act of betrayal, the name Ragusa would become a byword for treason in France, destroyed what little leverage Napoleon had left. The Allies, now in an unassailable position, rejected his conditional offer. They demanded a full, unconditional abdication. On April 6, 1814, in the quiet, gilded rooms of Fontainebleau, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, King of Italy, and Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, took a pen and signed the instrument of his unconditional abdication. "There is no personal sacrifice," he wrote, "that I am not ready to make for the interests of France." A few days later, he delivered a famous and emotional farewell to the remaining soldiers of his old guard in the main courtyard of the palace. Standing before the grizzled veterans who had followed him to the ends of Europe, many of whom were openly weeping, he kissed the eagle standard of their regiment and told them, "Do not mourn your fate. I will write of the great things we have done together." The scene was one of profound and tragic finality. The man who had dominated an age, whose ambition had redrawn the map of the world, was now a ruler without a country, an emperor without an empire. The great adventure, it seemed, was over. The exile to Elba. The victorious Allies were faced with a difficult question: what to do with Napoleon Bonaparte. Some, particularly the Prussians, wanted him executed as a menace to the peace of Europe. But Tsar Alexander, who saw himself as the magnanimous arbiter of the new European order, argued for a more lenient solution. The final decision was laid out in the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Napoleon would be stripped of his imperial title, but he would be allowed to retain the title of emperor in name only. He would be exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, located just off the coast of Tuscany. In a final, almost absurd gesture, he was to be granted full sovereignty over this tiny island, complete with his own small army, a navy, and a court. His wife, Marie-Louise, and his son were to be given the Duchy of Parma in Italy. It was a strange and deeply flawed arrangement, born of a mixture of magnanimity political compromise, and an underestimation of the man they were dealing with. They were treating a dormant volcano as if it were an extinct one.
The journey to Elba was a humiliating ordeal. As Napoleon traveled through southern France, a region that had always been staunchly royalist, he was met not with cheers, but with angry mobs who cursed him and threatened his life. For the first time, he was confronted with the raw hatred his wars had engendered. At one point, he was forced to disguise himself in an Austrian officer's uniform to escape a lynch mob. The experience deeply shook him. He arrived on Elba in early May 1814, a fallen giant on a miniature stage. The island was small, just over 80 square miles, with a population of about 12,000. But Napoleon, incapable of being idle, threw himself into the role of Emperor of Elba with the same manic energy he had once applied to ruling a continent. He designed a new flag for the island, reorganized its administration, improved its iron mines, built new roads, and renovated his palace. He held court, reviewed his small guard of loyal veterans who had been allowed to accompany him, and played the part of a benevolent, retired monarch.
But it was all a facade. He was restless, bored, and deeply frustrated. He was cut off from his wife and son, who had been taken back to Vienna by her father, and whom he would never see again. He received news from the mainland that the newly restored Bourbon monarchy in France, under the lumbering King Louis XVIII, was proving deeply unpopular. The Bourbons had learned nothing and forgotten nothing during their long exile. They were alienating the army, offending the new Napoleonic elite, and quickly squandering the goodwill of the French people. From his small island kingdom, Napoleon watched and listened. He knew that the soldiers of France still revered his name. He knew that the people were growing disillusioned with the new regime, and he knew that the Allied powers, busy arguing amongst themselves at the Congress of Vienna over the spoils of their victory, were distracted. The idea of a return, which had at first seemed impossible, began to take shape in his mind. The man of action was growing tired of his quiet cage. The world believed he was history, a figure consigned to the past, but Napoleon was already planning his final, most audacious gamble.
The dawn of a different Europe. With Napoleon confined to Elba and the Bourbon monarchy restored in Paris, the great powers of Europe convened in Vienna in the autumn of 1814 to redraw the map of the continent. The Congress of Vienna was a glittering affair, a grand assembly of emperors, kings, princes, and diplomats who danced and negotiated for months, attempting to create a new, stable European order from the wreckage of the Napoleonic Wars. Their guiding principles were legitimacy and the balance of power. They sought to restore the legitimate monarchs who had been deposed by Napoleon, and to create a system where no single nation could ever again dominate the continent, as France had done. The borders they drew would, for the most part, define Europe for the next century. France was reduced to its 1792 frontiers. Prussia was given territory in the Rhineland to act as a sentinel on the Rhine against future French aggression. Austria gained dominance in Italy. A new German confederation was created to replace the old Holy Roman Empire. The Congress was an attempt to turn back the clock, to erase the memory of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic adventure, and to restore the old world of monarchical order and aristocratic privilege.
But the ghost of Napoleon and the ideas he had both championed and suppressed could not be so easily exorcised. The wars had changed Europe in profound and irreversible ways. The Napoleonic Code, with its principles of legal equality and administrative rationality, remained in force in many parts of the continent. Feudalism, once swept away, could not be fully restored. More importantly, the wars had awakened the powerful force of nationalism.
The shared experience of resisting French domination had given the peoples of Spain, Germany, and Russia a new and powerful sense of national identity. The very idea of a people's war, of a nation in arms fighting for its freedom, was a legacy of this era. The monarchs gathered at Vienna sought to suppress this new force, to re-establish a Europe of dynasties, not of nations. But the genie of nationalism was out of the bottle, and it would become one of the most powerful and disruptive forces of the 19th century.
The age of Napoleon was over, but his shadow was long. He had been a contradictory figure, a son of the Revolution who had made himself an emperor, a liberator who had become an oppressor, a modernizer who had bled a continent dry. He left behind a Europe exhausted by war, but also a Europe that had been irrevocably transformed. He had swept away the last vestiges of the medieval world, and in doing so had cleared the ground for the birth of the modern one. As the diplomats in Vienna danced and debated, they were creating a world that they hoped would be free of the chaos and ambition of the man they had defeated. But the memory of his rise and fall, of the glory and the horror, would haunt the imagination of Europe for generations. A quiet, enduring testament to the extraordinary journey that had begun in the fires of revolution and ended, for now, on a small, sun-drenched island in the Mediterranean.